Our people are hungry, they are still poverty-stricken, they are living in destitution, yes. Our democracy has not delivered what it promised to them, yes. Democracy has not made them safe, yes. Democracy has not ended years of oppressive and suffocating corruption, yes. And yes, our people are still caught in the cusp of violence. However, our situation today is evident that our people have nailed their hopes for progress and development on the mask of democracy with all its flaws and very hostile, strong headwinds. It is historic for us in Nigeria that Nigeria has conducted 7 successive back-to-back elections since 1999 till date. These elections have been seriously flawed, they have been bloody, they have been chaotic, they have been below par. Yet, unlike a few years ago, Nigeria, neither the losers nor frustrated citizens of Nigeria have called the military to stage a coup, as it was, and it has always been the history of our country. Our people have now realized that military rule has proved itself to be a cure worse than the disease, and that the military itself has also realized the institutional damage it suffered from years of being in power. Therefore, the challenge now is for Africans of this generation to ensure that in our hands, the seeds of democracy are nurtured. Because of Nigeria, despite our troubles, despite our uncertainties, it has often been said that Nigeria, the unity of Nigeria is like a Catholic marriage. May not be happy that it doesn't break up. This discussion is timely and auspicious. However, your topic, How Democracies Die, should be replaced by a more hopeful title, How Democracies Can Survive. For indeed, who has ever seen the corpse of a dead democracy, or even once a carcass? Our concerns, of course, should be on how to learn lessons about the consequences of democracy dying and seeking how to avoid what is happening across Africa. Any good driver seeing another car in the ditch after an accident would do well not to pity the car that is in the ditch, but to obey the rules of the road. And there is a saying in Hausa, for those of you who speak Hausa, but translated it says, if you see your brother's beard on fire, put water on your own. Africans must learn that democracy is hard work with no easy answers, not because Africans are not searching well, but because those easy answers are not found anywhere. Revitalizing the civic space by free speech, a free media, and a civil society that is alive to its challenges is the best strategy of keeping authoritarianism at bay and keeping people hopeful. Ahead of Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, I published a book titled Democracy and Civil Society in Nigeria. And my conclusion in that book, then as now, very simple, that democracy and autocracy cancel themselves out. One cannot exist if the other, both of them cannot coexist, because one's existence defeats the existence of the other. This is neither the time nor the place to debate or define democracy. However, it is important to note that each democratic seed has had its own story of growth, harvest, or failure, depending on where and when it was sown, who nurtured it, on which soil, under what weather, and to what end. By way of definition, the world has come to accept Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech definition in 1863, that democracy is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, as literally cast in stone. However, on further interrogation, there are gaps in democracy's definition and its operational claims. Once we shift gears to identify geographical locations, cultures, and perceptions of who the people are, and who defines who the people are. And I cannot improve on what President Obasanjo just said, because I told him the quote of what he said should stand side by side with Abraham Lincoln's claim. And what is also very interesting is that Abraham Lincoln delivered this speech in 1863, and it's the same 1963, much later, 100 years later, that Martin Luther King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. And you notice that even in that speech, which was delivered, if you are familiar with Washington, with the statue of Abraham Lincoln, so India, when Martin Luther King says 100 years ago, he was referring to the Gettysburg speech. But of course, he makes the point that 100 years later, all the promises that were made or conceptualized in that speech have never really been realized. And I think we can repeat the same thing, that there's always a distinction and a dissonance between the claims of politics and political rhetoric of when people are in campaign and the realities when governance takes off. So for me, fundamental to how democracy grows and is appreciated is the need to develop a political culture. But of course, we accept, and we also know that systemic and consistent interruptions of this process by the military in Africa has created a sense of a culture of cynicism among our people. So if we are concerned about how democracies die, then like all dreams, we must accept the causes, that the causes are not the same. Because why X died is not the same with why B is alive. Therefore, when we speak of institutional fragility, shrinking spaces, the weakening and dismantling and weakening of democratic systems, do we see them as causes or consequences of the death of democracy? In other words, are we perhaps confusing the symptom with the disease? Particular diseases do not kill everyone. Not everybody who is suffering from cancer necessarily dies. Some people live longer. Not everybody people die of malaria. People die of all kinds of things. How do we explain the fact that the same sickness strikes one person, kills the person, but then other people are able? The medical people will tell you it depends on your immune capacity. Therefore, during the period of COVID, for example, the records seem to suggest, not necessarily, but at least that's what the doctors were saying, that most people who died during COVID had other underlying ailments, which COVID simply exploited. And I think we can therefore say the same thing about democracy, that its capacity and ability to survive depends on what are the underlying socio-economic, cultural conditions around which democracy is supposed to grow. In the last 20 or so years, the world has witnessed reversals and decline in many countries in Europe and America. We have witnessed the rise of what is now called illiberal democracies, sustained by right-wing hate groups. We are witnessing the rise of terrorism around the world. Although all of these pose severe threats to democracy, I would rather that we speak of the challenge to democracy rather than its death. In my view, as long as humans exist, there will always be democracy. If we see democracy from the point of view of its leaders, presidents, institutions, parliaments, senators, senate presidents, political associations, political parties, then we can contemplate its death, because all of these institutions are subject to human mortality. However, when we see democracy as part of the human instinct, thirst, hunger, and quest for love, for fairness, for integrity, for a sense of belonging, for community and family, then as long as these ideals exist and they sustain and define humanity, democracy cannot die. The democratic instinct and ethos is already embedded in our DNA. To be sure, politicians and political parties, parliaments, constitutions can be banned or destroyed, as we have seen with autocrats in uniform or out of uniform. But the human instincts that are supposed to nurture cannot die. We can therefore argue that certain types of structures for the pursuit of human happiness, security, and well-being could collapse in the hands of wicked men and women, but others will spring up. Democracies might die in form, just as food, arts, social habits differ among our peoples and countries, but the essence still remains the same. Now, you heard about Nigerians' jollof rice. Ghanaians are free to produce a poor copy, but still jollof rice. But when you know yourself that when you eat jollof rice in Ghana, when you eat jollof rice in Kenya, you know that they are just practicing. The problem of many African countries, but you might say jollof rice is jollof rice, but there are differentiations. The problem with many African countries is that they never really experience successful transitions. After colonial rule, and I think, again, my friend, Professor Ihonvere, has written extensively about this, that is the assumption that we have that we transited to democracy. No, transition from dictatorship is not logically transition to democracy. In part because, as we saw with successful transition, especially by the military, they still managed to embed within the system of transitions landmines that later on exploded to send us back to the bottom of the hill. So we went through rudimentary elections, but we never even developed a political culture. Africa transited from colonialism, military dictatorship, but did not successfully transit to democracy. The military often sowed many landmines. So when Western liberal democracies, which we have adopted across Africa, with their focus on free markets, when we neither have the freedom nor the markets, presupposes a capitalist economy when we don't have the capital. Focusing on such concepts like transparency, accountability, a free media, human rights, a free judiciary, rule of law, and a lot of talk about fighting corruption. The elevation of these concepts does not address other fundamental cultural factors that blur the lines in many African cultural discourse. And there are many people here, I'm sure President Obasanjo will also sign on to that, that in many African languages, for example, Western liberal democracy insists that opposition is institutionalized as part of democracy. But for many African countries, we're struggling, we're thinking in English, but unable to speak in vernacular. Because what does really opposition mean? And of course, many people will argue that because opposition is read in the vernacular as somebody who is an enemy, that is why it is easy for the reflex of the African politician to want to either bump off anybody who poses himself as an opposition. But of course, the system itself is not attractive because I served as a member of the Electoral Reform Committee in Nigeria. One of the things we saw was that you had cases where, for example, the dominant political party is such that everybody has to belong. And people who decided to vote differently, when they went back to their communities, the communities literally sent them back. They said, we don't want to be in opposition, because they know the consequences of being in opposition. So when we talk about this concept, it's important that we understand the cultural context in the African situation. The elevation of this concept does not address other fundamental issues. Anti-corruption waiting agencies, for example, sidestep the fact that corruption and other manifestations in African politics are often the symptom and not the disease. The Mo Ibrahim Index, for example, broadly measures the efficacy of democracy by such concepts like freedom, political participation, media, freedom, education, human rights, security, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, sustainable development, among many others. And there is no doubt that democracy is imperiled today, but it is not dead. Let us not become victims of what I call exaggerated pessimism. The story of the United States of America is a lesson. After over 200 years, the behavior of Donald Trump and his supporters on June 6, 2022, suggests that time and experience very often are not reasons for us to go to sleep. Because the human instinct for violence doesn't ever go to sleep. Therefore, we must remain vigilant over the claims that democracy makes. And the point, therefore, is that no matter how long democracy has been in our country, it is the strength of the institution that sustains the occasional assault to this foundation. Now, of course, if you live in a country like Nigeria, Ghana, and many African countries, a culture of cynicism has been embedded, because if you talk to Nigeria, people tell you, are we going to eat democracy? If you tell them it's going to take a long time, they say, how long is long enough? Yet, history suggests very clearly that democracy and its quest has no shortcuts. The challenge for those who govern is to ensure, I often use the metaphor of, I think women call it the pacifier. This little plastic rubber that women put in the mouth of a child. The child is sucking the rubber. There is nothing inside the rubber. But at least it enables the mother to continue cooking without disturbance. So in a way, African politicians must give us some plastic rubber to continue to manage, between now and the next election. Democracy's womb possesses many seeds, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's not so much the quarrels that politicians engage in. In fact, many ordinary Nigerians, including myself, continue to encourage our people. Please, when you see these politicians fighting, even if they are throwing chairs among themselves in parliament, don't kill yourself, because they will still close the door and distribute the money of state among themselves. In that area, there is no fight. So very often, many of us jump into thinking that, these politicians don't like themselves. No, they like themselves. Even armed robbers have common interests. So let's measure our enthusiasm, because very often we think that democracy is about to fall because our people are always fighting. As a priest, I have experience of helping resolve problems of marriage. In the end, I've had family, women and men, come to me and say, look, our marriage is no longer working. We're 10 years now, 5 years now, we're sleeping in the same room, but we're not sleeping on the same bed. Or people will tell you all kinds of things, but families themselves have realized that marriage, the priesthood, every vocation is a work in progress. And that is not so much a question of the problems of the moment, but the development of the inherent capacity which you can glean from friends and culture and history, but also drawing inspiration from the moral basis of your relationship, that things can work differently. And when a man realizes very clearly that he took his wife for granted, or that the wife realizes she took certain things for granted, it is possible for people to go back, renew their commitment, and have a much stronger relationship. Similarly, flawed elections are not necessarily evidence that democracy is not working. Very often it is the over-enthusiasm, but also agents of state, electoral bodies, the police, and so on, that often confuse the president with the state. Very often in our countries, the military, the security agencies believe that they confuse the state with the president. And they think that their obligation and responsibility is not to the people of Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, but it is protecting the regime that is in power. Rather than dying, democracy can lose its appeal and allure for very many reasons. But often the letter and the spirit of the Constitution are miles apart. Therefore, we must continue to make the point, that citizens' engagement with the institutions and instruments of state is fundamental to how democracy grows in our countries. Rather than believing that democracy is a game of experts and all we have to do is literally choose which club we are going to support. Being involved in democracy in your country is not the same as supporting Arsenal or supporting Liverpool or Manchester United. There are many of us who support any club that is holding a trophy. But it's much more than that. And the call is much deeper than that. And the sacrifice is much deeper than that. Because conceptually, we confuse office with power. Okay? There are people who are in office, but they are not in power. There are people who are in power, but they are not in office. And you can often see a lot of that from the fact that if you ask Nigerians, maybe who was your governor 20 years ago, average citizen will scratch because they can't remember. So it's about impact, but it's also about understanding that we are not just agents to be acted upon. Politicians must demonstrate the spirit of patriotism. A deliberate effort must be made by politicians to understand that their lives must reflect both the letter and the spirit of the claims of the Constitution. In this way, politics will not become a do or die affair, a ticket to the theater of corruption. Institutions like the judiciary, electoral bodies must inspire confidence among our people. I now want to try and end. The debate about democracy remains controversial, but it's also enchanting. It will continue to remain a subject of intense interest. Democracy is about systems, and systems will always remain in a state of flux because the goalposts of human expectation are constantly shifting. An American professor of political science called Kostika Bradatan published a very beautiful article. You can find it on the internet. But he titles the article, "Democracy is for the Gods." Because he's saying that the claims that democracy makes, humanly speaking, are literally unrealizable. But it's not an act of frustration. And there's a little book I just started reading last week. The title is The Shortest History of Democracy. And in it, John Keane, the author, says, and I quote, "Democracy remains the most potent weapon yet invented by humans for preventing malicious abuse of power. A system that aspires the dreams of how to prevent the few and the rich and the powerful who act as if they are mighty immortals that are born to rule." End of quote. John Keane further argues that actually, contrary to what we claim, democracy did not start in Athens, because he makes the point, hundreds of years before the Athenians began using assemblies, the Syrians, the Phoenicians, the Indians were also gathering, but their system was not as framed as what happened we're basically the same with what happened in Athens. Now, of course, Amartya Sen wrote a very beautiful book. The title of the book is The Argumentative Indian. And he makes the point. It's a direct frontal assault at the claims of Western civilization. And Amartya Sen said, look, we as Indians, we are always arguing for 10, 20 hours so don't give us the impression that we are supposed to learn any of these things from. So it speaks to the need for us in our democracy to also deal with practical issues of what are the cultural surroundings around which we make our claims. I wish to conclude by arguing that contrary to the notion of democracy dying, we should focus on addressing the usage of the various models for the achievement of the goals of human development. Democracy is a subject, and it is subject to toxicity, it is subject to decay, to rot, to fracture, but not to death. Democracy will never die. There will be bad elections. But the only cure to a bad election is another election. Often, those who pose the greatest threat to democracy are the elected officials who often, as one of our Nigerian politicians, a friend of mine who died just about last month, Mr. Audu Ogbe, who once said that, he said to me, he said, Nigerian politicians believe that people vote for us to enjoy on their behalf. So the assumption that politicians have that the rest of us who voted for you are so stupid, and that all we are supposed to do is to stand and look at you in your beautiful cars, your beautiful houses, and we are all just spectators. All we can choose is which team are we going to clap for. Participatory democracy means participating in elections, but also participating in reaping, the outcome. So I therefore want to end by saying, first of all, it's a great honor, President Jonathan, for me to be here. When you took that decision on March 31st, 2015, he's written a little book, which you should read, My Transition Hours. But when you took that decision, it was one of those moments that it was between yourself, your conscience, your God, against the run of play. On the 31st of March 2015, even before the elections had concluded, when you made that call, you were answering what to me was more or less a divine call. And by taking that decision, not only did you reverse, and I think your successor made the point himself over and over, you had all the military, you had all the paraphernalia of power around you. It would have been possible to instigate a war. But by taking that decision, in my view, the people of Athens entrusted into your hands a torch of hope, a torch of what democracy should look like. The honor, the dignity, the sense of sacrifice. That is what democracy is all about. You illustrated that. And it's the reason why when you call, I will come. When you knock, I will open the door. Because right now, I had to excuse myself from a meeting of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Nigeria, which is still on. Our meeting is finishing actually on Sunday. But I had to excuse myself to be here because I thought it was a great honor for me, to be with you. But please, General Theophilus Danjuma, one of our greatest statesmen, President Obasanjo's colleague, once said, very often, the voice of the devil is not so far from the voice of God. Listen very carefully to those who want to use you as an instrument for the elongation of their interests, and not your interests or the interests of Nigeria. Think very clearly, pray very clearly. Final decision, it's your call. Finally, some years back, John Major, a former British Prime Minister, addressed top-level politicians in the UK. And he started his speech by posing a question. He said, if after 850 years of our democracy in the United Kingdom, if there is one person in this room that believes that we have gotten it right, please raise your hand. After 850 years, if there's anybody who believes that we in the United Kingdom have succeeded in our democracy, please raise your hand. Of course, no hand went up. Therefore, and I want to end by saying something about what is now catching flame, the hopes, the expectation, the hysteria around our young generation called Gen Z. Being young is a transition. But transition to adulthood and responsibility. Very often, many young people in Africa don't have the experience that people of our generation had. Many of us have the past that we grew up with. Because many young people today are born in Accra, born in Nigeria, but brought up in the United Kingdom or other places, and the children of the elite. Therefore, their expectations are pretty high. And they also, this is a culture of fast food. But democracy cannot be served as a fast food menu. taking responsibility to govern is not the same as wanting or aspiring to participate in the meal of corruption. Because very often many people in Africa, many young people in Africa, many groups that feel disadvantaged, rather than focusing on the real things, what do we need to do? What kind of discipline do we need to put in place? Because if you want to be president tomorrow, governor next tomorrow, we should see the signs today. There is a saying among the beggars in northern Nigeria, who are the Muslim beggars, that if Friday is going to be good, that is based on the gifts I will be given, I will see it on Wednesday. So if you want to be president of Nigeria or Ghana or your country, begin to study the mistakes that those who came from behind have made. Begin to understand the history, how this struggle has come through. It is no use to pretend that simply just knowing how to kick a football means that you can play like Messi. It's not going to be so. I remember I used to watch Ronaldinho when he was a young man. But Ronaldinho said sometime when he was being interviewed, he said, look, my brother and I, we used to spend 8 hours just practicing. So when you see Ronaldinho do the things he does with the ball, it's not because the ball is in his feet. So I make the point. Tolstoy once said, all unhappy families are unhappy differently. The reason why democracies have failed somewhere may not be the same with the reasons why democracies have failed in our own situation. But democracy has survived through tough times and has suffered afflictions. Democracy has survived cancers. It has survived demagogues, mobsters, empires, emperors, narcissism, apartheid, and other forms of evil. But as long as there are brave men and women like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Steve Biko, Václav Havel, Aung San Suu Kyi, the young Chinese boy whom we saw in 1990 when at Tiananmen Square. Many of you can Google and see him. A tank was coming before him and he had only a cellophane bag. The tank was going this way, he was going to say, come and crush me. As long as the human imagination that has inspired people like Steve Biko, Mahatma Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, Malala, and thousands of other young people across the world, as long as that spirit is still in us, democracy will not die. The winds may blow, its flames will never go out, and all of us, you and I, are custodians of that flame. Thank you very much, and may God bless you.
I think we can do better than that, please. Let's indeed give our keynote speaker